Thank you very, very much. This is a great honor and a real pleasure to be here in Milan, and the first 2 days of the conference have been wonderful. Let me just make sure, and thanks for your patience. We had some technical difficulties getting this to show up, and now it has, and I appreciate that. I also want to thank you. I understand that there is a distraction happening right now with the Italian World Cup match, and if there are any Costa Ricans in the audience, the Costa Rican match as well. And I, as a television media scholar, I am fully accepting of the second screen as a mode of viewing. So feel free, if you have a second screen, to keep apprised of what's happening. And if there's a outburst in the crowd, I'll assume something happened, and you can let me know, and we can share that information. As Jaap said, this is part of my book project. Complex Television, and I'll give you a brief overview of the book. And I thought it was I was first very honored to be asked to give a keynote at this conference, but I also thought, well, asking an American scholar who will be presenting about American television to present on the European Cinema and Media Conference seems a little odd, but the book does have some very deep European ties, at least in the process, if not the content. The majority of the chapters were written while I was on fellowship in Göttingen in the 11-12 academic year, and during that year I traveled around Europe and gave a lot of parts of this book in a number of different countries. Some of you I met during that time and fostered some great relationships. So I'm glad to be back here in Europe to talk about it. The book, and this is not what the cover will look like, it's just my mock-up. I actually got the word today from the press that the book is now officially in production, meaning that it's someone else's problem, which makes me very happy. So the book will come out in the spring from NYU Press, but as Jaap said, it's actually online right now. So if you follow that link, it will take you to Media Commons Press, where all of the chapters, the first draft of the chapters, were posted and are still available for reading, for feedback, although since it's now in someone else's hands, that feedback won't be implemented in any sort of way, but you can go on the record perhaps if you'd like. In general, the book offers theories of television narrative focused on the contemporary trend of serialized primetime programming in America that I term narrative complexity. Narrative complexity is a blend of episodic and serial norms. And when I analyze this, I am focused primarily on textual features, but always in the context of the shifts in technology, in the industry, and in viewer practices that have been occurring over the past 20 years. The book outlines the way in which these shows employ non-conventional storytelling techniques, varying temporality and perspectives using fantasy blurs, explicit narration, long-term enigmas. These programs often use reflexive use of norms, which leads to a self-conscious and explicit storytelling mechanics that viewers come to recognize and follow the concept of the operational aesthetic, which I borrow from Neil Harris in his work on P.T. Barnum. And this leads to a way of engaging where there's a pleasure of process, not just product. The narrative itself becomes a machine to be admired, and storytelling becomes a spectacle and special effect in and of itself. And finally, this leads to a mode of viewer engagement that I call forensic fandom, where viewers participate in these programs as amateur narratologists, fitting with the cultural logic of the digital age, where participatory culture online allows for collective engagement in these serialized texts throughout the gaps between episodes and seasons. Now, the book as a whole has a number of different chapters that you can see here outlined, but today I'm going to focus on the chapter on authorship, trying to understand how television is created, but moreover how the understanding of television's creative process impacts how programs are made and how we watch them. And hopefully this will resonate with the conference theme of creativity. So before diving into my theories of authorship, let me go ahead and start with a short clip that I'll use as an example throughout my discussion. Now this is a moment from the 5th season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, so some of you may be familiar with it. It's from the first episode, and it's kind of the epilogue of the episode. You need to know almost nothing about the show to understand the basic comprehension as to what's going on here. And I'll explain how this closing moment from the episode matters for authorship in a moment. And hopefully the sound could go a little louder, but we'll see.
I'm out of here. Riley and I are going to the movies.
Okay, have a good time.
What are you doing here?
Buffy, if you're going out, why don't you take your sister?
Mom!
Okay, so if you haven't seen the show, this is a totally unremarkable moment of teen drama. But if you have, you know that it's a very important moment because it is the first appearance of a new character, Buffy's 14-year-old sister, Dawn. Now this, like I said, was at the beginning of the 5th season, so at this point fans had invested more than 50 hours of viewing watching this series, and they knew that Buffy was an only child. And suddenly they were being told that she had a teenage sister who had never been seen before. Now, the next episodes to air clarified very little. Dawn was just accepted as part of the ensemble, where there was no explanation for how she suddenly came to exist, and all the other characters acted as if Dawn has always been part of the story world, despite the fact that we viewers knew differently. Now, fans understandably panicked. So in the gaps between episodes, they vented their anxieties in the show's vibrant online discussion boards. And some fans were very skeptical. They said, well, this is typical of a teen drama where the network says these characters are getting too old, so introduce a younger cousin or someone to come in to provide that youth appeal. But because the show was so clearly treating Dawn as an established character and not a new addition, the show was challenging viewers' beliefs in the fictional world that they'd come to know and love in previous seasons. And it posed this narrative enigma of who, or more accurately, we will later learn what Dawn really is. And that was not actually answered, and only partially answered, in the season's 5th episode. Now, we've got to remember that in the original airing, this process took a full month, with week-long gaps between episodes where fans theorized and also stressed about what was going on. When would the enigma be solved, and would the solution be satisfying? And some fans were very skeptical, but I would say that the majority of them, a common refrain emerged among these fans: trust Joss. And this here is the graphic. This was made later, but this is the graphic that expresses this sentiment. Now, this, of course, refers to Joss Whedon, the show Buffy's creator, executive producer, head writer, and frequent director. In other words, the text author, by any basic conception of authorship. But it's an unusual moment in television storytelling and fan consumption in terms of explicitly calling out to trust the author. But I believe it's indicative of these larger tendencies of how television authorship functions. And that will be the focus of my talk today. I'm going to focus on 3 related practices that highlight the way in which television authorship works and why it matters. The first is material production, understanding how serial television is created, how it is authored. And I'm going to focus on the tension between the collaborative realities of television production versus the romantic notion of singular authorship, which is embodied in the very specific American context of the showrunner. The second question focuses on how authorship circulates discursively. So how is television authorship understood through the broader discursive analysis of the changing role of television showrunners as public figures and celebrities in their own right? Finally, I consider the pragmatic reception of authorship. How do viewers use television authorship? Looking at the process of consumption where imagining an authorial presence is vital to comprehension and interpretation, as in with that call to trust Joss. So these three facets of material, discursive, and pragmatic analysis will hopefully suggest the central importance that authorship plays in framing our engagement with contemporary serial television. So this first facet, the material production of serial television, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the production process. I'm assuming many of you don't know how American television is created. But before laying that out, I want to contrast it with other models of creativity, especially the places where the concept of authorship has been most valuable. So in literature, literary authorship is seen generally as a site of origination. A singular author devises every word in a text. Now, those of us who have studied literature know that's not the way it works, but nonetheless, that's the way people think about it, and that's the way authors often present it. So this is our baseline understanding of what an author does, originate the text. Film obviously complicates this model as it's highly collaborative, and film critics, as we all know, have focused on the director as the site of authorship, not because she or he originates all ideas, but because the director takes responsibility for all choices. So in film, it's authorship by responsibility. Any particular moment or image may not have been planned or executed by the director, but ultimately it's the director who is responsible for its inclusion in the final film. Now, television's serial form changes the nature of the production process and thus the attribution of authorship. The need to create an ongoing series that runs for months and years often is a very different process than the bounded system of film production, as there are many tasks being undertaken simultaneously. So this complicated system requires managerial oversight typically granted to one or more individuals with the somewhat vague credit of producer. And the authority granted to this role has led television to frequently be termed a producer's medium, most notably by Horace Newcomb in the 70s. Under this model, the producer, rather than the director, is accorded the final responsibility for the choices that shape the finished work, in a model of authorship by management, evoking the leadership and oversight that managers take outside of television in the context of both business and sports teams. So here, the producer's managerial function is not to deny their roles in originating ideas or taking responsibility for choices, but it emphasizes the additional role that television authors must take in helming an ongoing series that functions as a sustained team rather than a standalone work. So the history of television producers is complicated, and I'm not going to go into it depth here, but for contemporary serial television, the key figure is the showrunner. The showrunner almost always serves as the head writer of a series, and their official credit is executive producer, although there are many executive producers on many series and only one usually showrunner. Typically, the creator of the show is also the showrunner, although that can change, often midstream. Most programs have a stable group of 6 to 12 writers, many of whom also serve as producers for the show. And the writer's room becomes the nerve center of a series with the showrunner overseeing and managing the room. Most writers' rooms function both as hierarchical collectives with clear rankings of leadership and authority, and as open collaborations where all writers' contributions are incorporated into a creative stew. Now, there are rare programs where a singular writer operates more or less on their own outside a writer's room. David E. Kelley from Ally McBeal fame, or Aaron Sorkin from The West Wing both operate that way. But most serialized primetime programs emerge out of the room. Typically what happens is that writers will meet for a few weeks before the season begins production to map out the season-long arcs and episodes, establishing key benchmarks along the way, and decide on the season's narrative structures. After establishing the key narrative arcs that will be followed throughout the season, the writers' room collectively will break episodes into outlines. So each episode is broken into key story beats, oftentimes on whiteboards, and then they take photographs of that as the outline for the episode. And then once they have that collectively generated outline, the episode will be assigned to a specific writer to shape into a full script with dialogue and action descriptions. And the way that writers work on American television is that the writers beyond the showrunner typically are not trying to create an individualistic script that stands apart from the series as their own work, but rather to mimic the showrunner's voice for an effort of stylistic and tonal consistency. Once a showrunner finalizes a script, it usually has to climb the corporate ladder for executives to approve and provide notes. And the writing credits for an episode are assigned in a variable process. Typically, it's given to the writer who first drafts the script, but the story construction and script revisions are a more collective process that are organized through this discrete hierarchy that's unique to every individual show. So back to the Buffy example, even though Joss Whedon was not credited as the writer for any of the season 5 episodes where Dawn was introduced, his role as showrunner made him responsible for the character. His managerial oversight of the writer's room places the idea's origination within his authorial realm, even if it wasn't he himself who came up with or executed the idea individually. Now, there's an interesting case study to highlight the different authorial roles, and that's Lost, the highly popular series that debuted in 2004. Every episode lists 3 people as the show's creator. So I don't know if you can read them there. It says created by Jeffrey Lieber and J.J. Abrams, ampersand, Damon Lindelof. And the difference between the and the ampersand is actually significant. The and means working separately, the ampersand means working together. And it has legal union definitions as well. Now, this appears on every episode of Lost, but the origination of the idea actually is not credited in any episode of Lost. The idea actually came from a former ABC executive, Lloyd Braun. He came up for the basic concept of the show for a show about people stranded on a desert island. And he hired Jeffrey Lieber, the first name here, to write a pilot, which he thought didn't work, so he rejected it. But he was really committed to the idea, so he asked J.J. Abrams, who at the time was running the show Alias for ABC as well, to try. But Abrams said that he was too busy, so he asked for another writer to work with. An agent suggested Damon Lindelof as a partner, and Lindelof's goal was to meet J.J. Abrams because he was a really big fan. So they got together and had this meeting, they hit it off, and they came up with this outline. And the funny thing is that the assumption was that this show would actually never get made because the rumor within the industry was that Lloyd Braun was about to be fired. So J.J. Abrams did it as a favor for his boss on his way out of the organization, and Damon Lindelof actually did it because he wanted a job on Alias. But in one of his last acts on ABC, Lloyd Braun greenlit the pilot and authorized a then record $11 million to produce the pilot, even though a script had never been written, which is more or less unheard of in American television. And a lot of people say it was out of spite to his ABC bosses who were about to fire him. And once the contract was signed, he actually did get fired, and the pilot was being shot in sort of record time. They came up with a script in sort of, I think it was like 2 weeks to write the script, and then the production. And ABC had invested so much money into the project at that point that they felt obliged to put it on the air. Again, they thought it was going to be a flop because it was fairly ludicrous. Abrams and Lindelof made it as ludicrous as they could because they were having fun trying to make a show that they assumed wouldn't actually make it to the air. And then, of course, as we know, it became a surprise hit. And it forced Abrams and Lindelof to come up with a way to deal with all these complex mysteries that they had created without any solutions in mind. So the reason why Jeffrey Lieber appears on every episode and gets paid for every episode is because of union negotiations. He essentially told the Writers Guild that, this is my work, this is what they came up with, and the Writers Guild said, sure, that influenced it, so you get a credit and royalties. Abrams actually left to make movies shortly after shooting the pilot, and Lindelof, who had never run a show before, certainly not one as elaborate and high budget as Lost, he brought in Carlton Cuse as co-showrunner, because Carlton Cuse was a much more experienced writer who Lindelof had worked with. But it's interesting because the press and fans still, for many years, referred to it as J.J. Abrams' show Lost, even though Abrams had almost no day-to-day involvement after the first 2 months of production. Now, this example speaks to the differences between the material production processes and how authorship is viewed, promoted, and circulated in broader culture. So this leads to the second facet of authorship I want to talk about, which is how authorship is produced rhetorically. As I suggested, it's not equivalent to the material creative process of writing and production. So as we think about the way in which we understand television authorship, it raises a question. Is commercial television authored or produced? Certainly, a lot of people look at the commercial basis of television and say that this is not an authored work the way that other creative artworks are, but rather it's produced as in a factory. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, in that the production model is much more regimented and much more formulaic in television than it is in most other media. But I think that if we look at the cultural positioning of television writers as authors, it becomes clear that the concept of television authorship matters, even if it doesn't fully describe the way that the shows are created. So if authorship is a discursive product of television storytelling itself, we should seek inspiration from Foucault's influential notion of the author function. He defines authorship as a function of discourse that works to attribute, classify, delimit, contextualize, hierarchize, and authenticate creative works. So let me go ahead and outline how, over the past couple of decades, American television has seen this author function work in all these different ways. So one element is attribution. Authorship has become a brand name. So you have creators like Aaron Sorkin, J.J. Abrams, and Shonda Rhimes, all of whom have dedicated fan bases that are tied to their names. Industry, fans, critics all use these types of authorial attribution as a way to validate particular shows before seeing them, ensuring initial viewership in fan bases. And these showrunners have become celebrities in their own right. And 20, 25 years ago, this was unthinkable in American television. Television writers were really an anonymous breed for the most part. An interesting subset of attribution is when a showrunner performs in his or her own series, often playing a writer character, as with Tina Fey and Lena Dunham, or a fictionalized version of themselves, as with Larry David and Louis C.K. Now, these representations help both convey and satirize assumptions about writers and their authorial roles. And they really contribute to our understanding of, well, what do TV writers do and how do they live their lives? A key function of authorship in any medium is classification. The works tied together under an author's brand name that create intertextual associations and expectations by genre, theme, tone, and style. Often such branding helps motivate viewers to stick with a show and hope that it will grow to match the author's previous work. Thus, for instance, Joss Whedon's series Dollhouse started slowly, but fans started to draw connections with his other series and kept watching in hopes that the series would develop to match Buffy and Angel, his previous hits. And you can actually see here, or you might not be able to see here, but the video actually attributes the series as Joss Whedon's Dollhouse explicitly. That ties to notions of distinction, tied to aesthetic hierarchies that are tied to people's authorial identity and previous work. And these can be both high and low categories. So if we compare Chuck Lorre and Greg Daniels, now if you know these two showrunners, you'll know which will be assumed to be more sophisticated, mature, and clever versus lowbrow and vulgar. So Lorre on the left there is with his 2.5 Men cast. He's the lowbrow and vulgar one. And Greg Daniels on the right is with Amy Poehler, star of his show Parks and Recreation. And he also did the American version of The Office. This ties to the notions of expectations, where a showrunner's previous successes can set unreasonable comparisons and frames of reference for future work. David Simon established his reputation by creating The Wire. Now, his follow-up show, Treme, couldn't match the hype and expectations. Now, I would argue it's a very different show and trying to do many different things than The Wire, but I think most people saw it as The Wire in New Orleans, and it fell short of that expectation. It's not trying to be that, but the authorial function made people want that to be the identity of the show. Simon ties into this notion of authentication. A creator's background outside of television can support notions of authority and expertise. So The Wire drew upon Simon's background as a crime reporter in Baltimore, as well as some of his other writers who had been cops, teachers, and reporters. Now, issues of authenticity can also be a detriment. The 5th season of The Wire focused on the journalism of the Baltimore Sun, where Simon had previously been a reporter, and a lot of people see that as too much axe grinding of old grudges that he had from his days as a reporter there. Other questions of authenticity can arise about writers' ability to capture the voices of their subjects. As with The Wire's prominent African-American cast, the vernacular of that show, which is very distinctive, was written by a mostly white writer's room. And in the early years, all the actors, the African-American actors, when they were interviewed, were often asked, so do you improvise the dialogue? And they're like, no, that's exactly how it appears on the page. The writers coach us on how to speak in Baltimore accents. So there's a very different notion of authenticity there. Now, as I suggested earlier, television authors are produced by the television industry with the increased discursive circulation fueling the prominence of the author function. Traditionally, they've been more marginal figures, but the growth of online media has certainly changed this. So showrunners are now public figures using personal sites like blogs, Twitter, appearing on fan forums, or in personal appearances at conventions. All of these help to fuel the author function of these individual showrunners and create their brand identity. And this here, you can see, this is Shonda Rhimes' Twitter page, and at 618,000 followers, I believe she is the most followed showrunner who's not also an actress like Tina Fey. And this is a good time to make a brief aside here about the identity of television showrunners. Aside from Rhimes, the vast majority of the examples I talk about are white men, and it's because they are the vast majority of television writers in America. The stats from last year said that only 30% of all television writers were women, and only 18% of executive producers were women. Only 15% of television writers are non-white, and only 8% of executive producers are not white. So it's not much of a focus of my chapter, but I think that thinking about the way in which television authors are discursively produced can help us understand one reason why these positions continue to lag the diversity of the American population. The authenticization and hierarchizing functions of authorship discourse tap into broader cultural norms about race and gender in America, where white male authority is still considered the default. Returning to this discursive circulation of television authorship, the growth of official paratexts like DVD commentaries, televised or online making-of programs, recap episodes, and regular podcasts all fuel the circulation of showrunners. This is an image of Breaking Bad showrunner Vince Gilligan, and it's from a TV show that started last year called The Writer's Room on Sundance Channel, which is essentially a weekly talk show where they interview TV writers about their show. This is clearly a site where authorship is performed and produced for a large audience. Now, different showrunners establish different voices in terms of the way in which they interact with fans. These paratexts can present different perspectives on sometimes the same person. They often will foreground the writer as a sort of very accessible fan or sort of fellow geek, especially in sci-fi shows. So via videos and podcasts, Damon Lindelof, the co-creator of Lost, comes across as the enthusiastic fan of Star Wars, Star Trek, and other sort of geek cred shows. And this creates a relatable, playful persona that sci-fi fans feel like he's one of us. But at the same time, showrunner paratexts assert authors as sites of interpretive authority, telling us what's correct and not within the narrative universe. And this will often create tension when a narrative takes a turn against fan interests or expectations, with the most engaged viewers actively consuming these paratexts that push against their interpretations. Importantly, many of these paratexts are consumed serially alongside the core television series. So weekly podcasts or Twitter feeds, blog entries all become serial texts themselves, where fans fill the gaps between episodes with these serial paratexts, and such consumption becomes part of the ritual engagement of many of these shows. Sometimes text and paratext can explicitly interact, where fans will watch an episode and then anticipate how the podcast or the post-show episode or the Twitter stream will discuss those scenes. And this really points to the third facet of authorship that I want to talk about, authorship as a component of media reception. So television viewers use these authorial paratexts and textual features to construct notions about authorship that help guide their understanding and engagement with the series. I would argue that authorship is most vital in this reception process, as that is where the rhetoric of the author function becomes active, shaping viewer processes of interpretation, evaluation, comprehension, and engagement. But to understand how authorship functions as part of the viewing process, I want to take a brief detour into literary theory. So many of you may be familiar with the concept of the implied author from Wayne Booth in the 1950s. There's a long-standing debate about this, and I'm not going to dive into it, but I do want to think about how this concept was brought into film studies. And as far as I can tell, there are two basic schools of thought. One is Seymour Chapman, who argues that the implied author is distinct from the biographical real author who created the work, whether it's literature or film. Chapman talks about both, but it serves as the source of narrative's origination. Quote, the agent intrinsic to the story whose responsibility is the overall design. So Chapman's concept of the implied author is the embodiment of textual intent, and thus it functions as a reference point for viewers trying to interpret a film. When we ask, what does that film mean? Chapman's saying we are seeking to understand what the implied author means. Countering Chapman is David Bordwell, who refuses to use the implied author in his model of cinematic narration because he says it adds little to our analytic abilities as critics, claiming that the film's storytelling techniques themselves are sufficient for conducting narrative analysis. Here's a lengthy quote that you'll see why I want to read it in a moment. Quote, as for the implied author, this construct adds nothing to our understanding of filmic narration. No trait we could assign to an implied author of a film could not more simply be ascribed to the narration itself. It, meaning the narration, sometimes suppresses information, restricts our knowledge, generates curiosity, creates a tone, and so on. To give every film a narrator or implied author is to indulge in an anthropomorphic fiction. Now, I think that the Chapman-Bordwell debate, they're in common agreement on most things. They believe that the text itself is the agent of storytelling, not the real biographical author. But the debate boils down to whether such agency is best understood as an anthropomorphic author, as with Chapman, or a system of narrational properties, as with Bordwell. But I think there's a more interesting use of this concept for understanding television storytelling. Instead of looking at the way that implied author may or may not be lodged in a text, I'm curious how viewers use the concept of authorship to guide their processes of reception and comprehension, because I believe many viewers themselves indulge in an anthropomorphic fiction by constructing notions of authorship in the process of viewing. Such authorial construction is not lodged solely in the text, as it exists in the moments of television reception, working within the broader contextual circulation of the author function discourses that I've outlined. So by looking at reception practices, we can see the implied author used as part of the process of narrative comprehension. Now, because this book is sort of a work of narratology in a way, I'm of course introducing new terms because that's what narratologists do. So to avoid confusion with the implied author, I use the term the inferred author function. So inferred contrasts with implied to highlight that authorship is not solely being construed through textual implication, but rather inferred by the consumption practice. Foucault's function retains the centrality of the context and discursive circulation of authorship, that it's, again, not just in the text, but in this broader discursive context. To briefly define how I use this term, the inferred author function is a viewer's production of authorial agency responsible for a text's storytelling, drawing upon textual cues and contextual discourses. In more practical terms, when we watch a TV episode and wonder, why did they do that? The inferred author function provides our notion of they as the agents responsible for the storytelling. The prevalence of authorial discourses, as I've charted, suggests that for many television viewers, that agency is lodged within this imagined construct of a personified authorial force and linked to the discourses of authorship that they have been consuming. So some critics are skeptical of the idea that consumers construct authorial agents in the process of narrative comprehension, citing narrative immersion as keeping viewers engaged in the story world rather than thinking about its construction. Here, Torben Grodal talks about this in terms of upstream and downstream comprehension. And throughout the book, I argue that complex serial television embraces the operational aesthetic, where viewers simultaneously are engaged in a story and thinking about its narrative construction. And the operational aesthetic, I would say, encourages viewers to think about authorial agency, as marveling at these reflexive narrative mechanics asks us to contemplate the agency behind their creation. Additionally, seriality itself encourages the inferred author function. The gaps between episode, and even the gaps within episode for commercial breaks in the American system, disrupts narrative immersion and allows viewers to contemplate the program in a much more reflexive manner, certainly than the average cinematic viewer. We fill these gaps with conversations and paratextual consumption, and sometimes production for some fans, often evoking notions of authorship to help explain our interpretations or guide our engagement. There's a long history of serial consumers engaging with authors, both real and inferred, dating back to readers writing to Dickens as his serial installments were being published, or comic book readers contributing to letters pages published at the back of issues. These gaps and venues for interaction make the authorial function a dialogue, bleeding into the ongoing consumption of serial programs. As authorship is developed textually through discursive circulation, the inferred author function itself is a serialized text, developing and changing over time in ways that both feed back to the originating text and establish an ongoing relationship between viewers and these inferred authorial figures. The key use of the inferred author function is in grounding our narrative interpretation and comprehension and speculation of what will come. Our notions of authorship become central parts of how we make sense of what we are watching. Now, to synthesize these multiple ways that television authorship functions in series, let me offer two brief examples. The first is NBC's sitcom Community, which I don't know if it's traveled much in Europe. It became a cult obsession by the end of its first season. It's a very reflexive show with a lot of genre parodies, and almost every episode has some sort of breaking of the fourth wall and acknowledging the way in which it is a sitcom and working under the constraints of network television. And much of the fandom of the show engaged with its showrunner, Dan Harmon, who maintained an active and irreverent Twitter account, a blog about his own writing process and personal life, and gave frequent interviews to television critics. After the third season, where Harmon had a very tumultuous time, publicly feuding with actor Chevy Chase, he regularly missed budget and production deadlines and was allegedly struggling with a drinking problem, he was fired from his own series. Now, predictably, fans revolted, and the press engaged in deep speculation for what this might mean for the series going forward. The fourth season aired the following year with new showrunners, and it was generally disliked by both die-hard fans and critics. And the surprising twist here was after the fourth season, NBC renewed the low-rated series for a fifth season and rehired Harmon to take over the show again. And the fifth season just ended, and it appears that it will be the final season. NBC has canceled it. It may get picked up somewhere else, but it's unlikely. And that fifth season was hailed as a return to form by fans and critics, a shift that was almost unanimously attributed to Harmon's authorial prowess. So this case evokes all three facets of television authorship I've discussed. Harmon was the showrunner, but he was not the only writer who left the series over the years. Most notably, Chris McKenna, who was second in command in the writer's room for the second and third seasons. He left after season 3 with Harmon and then returned in season 5 with Harmon. McKenna's role, which includes both managing the writer's room on a day-to-day basis and handling Harmon's extreme behavior, is rarely acknowledged as serving an authorial function. Authorship is generally attributed solely to Harmon as the embodiment of the collective creative process. Harmon remains, to this day, a very active paratextual presence, both with his Twitter account and blog, and he runs a live show and podcast called Harmontown. And these discursive productions help maintain his authority and singularity as the ultimate voice of community. And this authority extends to many viewer reactions, as the inferred author function of Harmon's persona structures how fans make sense of the series, especially in treating the Harmonless season 4 as an aberration. While there's no objective way to measure whether the 4th season is notably unlike the others in quality, fans clearly framed their evaluations and interpretations with Harmon's absence structuring their judgments. It would be very interesting to research whether there were any regular viewers who didn't consume any of the paratext or the behind-the-scene knowledge and had no idea that Harmon left during those 4th season. But given that the show had such a small and cultish viewership, I'm pretty sure that all viewers also engage in the fan community, because it's just what the show's identity is all about. So the case of Harmon and community, I'd say, is an example of off-screen action impacting how we understand the television text in terms of authorship. My second example stems from a textual moment that spilled from the show off-screen. And to lay this out, I want to show you another brief clip. This is an ambiguous moment from the final moments of Breaking Bad's 3rd season finale. Really, all you have to know in this scene is that one of the main characters, Jesse, has been sent to assassinate another sort of drug manufacturing colleague, Gail. And it's very dark, so I apologize if you can't make it out.
How can I help you? Take whatever you want. I have money. I got a lot of money. I have, please, don't do this. You don't have to do this.
So the key question here for this case study is what happened in terms of the basic narrative action. Did Jesse shoot Gail? So when this show aired, the episode first aired, fans quickly leapt online to debate. Did he really shoot it, or did he move the gun? Showrunner Vince Gilligan, whose stamp we see here, was surprised by this ambiguity, as he said in numerous interviews following the finale that he intended no lack of clarity whatsoever. He wanted the camera to move in that final shot to make it seem like Jesse was shooting into the audience as an homage to the great train robbery, as so this classic gangster moment, but not to suggest that the gun moved at all. But fans were really obsessing. Oh, no, we're pretty sure the gun moved, etc. So it's interesting, after a few days, in some subsequent interviews, Gilligan suggests that he might revisit this unintentional ambiguity and spare Gail in season 4. And these statements prompted fans to speculate about both potential outcomes, using authorial paratext to support their competing positions throughout the 13-month gap until the next episode aired. And actually, the next episode starts with Gail alive, but it soon becomes clear that this is a flashback. And we flash forward to the current time where we see Gale's dead body. So this sequence invites viewers to posit this authorial presence, playing with their expectations and building on the paratextual conversation about Gale's ambiguous shooting. We could follow the sort of anti-anthropomorphic approach that Bordwell advocates and regard it as the series playing with audience expectations, but I would say that the prevalence of the showrunner's voice in these paratexts encourages us to personalize such intentionality, attaching it to an inferred construction of Gilligan, who embodies the entire collaborative team in the mind of viewers. So I'd like to conclude my talk with a little bit of a provocation, and I want to return to the opening case study of Trust Joss. Now, in this phrase, Joss was not the biographical creator of Buffy, nor the industrial discourses that constructed his public persona, but the inferred author function constructed by viewers out of their textual and paratextual consumption. For viewers invested in Buffy's ongoing storytelling, they confronted their doubts about this new narrative development by looking toward the authorial and authoritative figure that had served them well for the first 4 seasons, imbuing the show's creator with knowledge and power that they trusted would provide ultimate answers. Now, this provocation is, I would call this trust in Joss, despite lagging faith, is many ways a religious move, invoking the author as calling out to a higher power, a supreme creator who must have a greater plan that will be revealed to us mere mortals in due time. This is consistent with broader religious terminology that suffuses conversation about television storytelling. Every program features a series Bible that provides all the rules and background that the writers must follow. Fans debate whether paratexts are continuations of the core narrative via the ecclesiastical term canon. Now, I'm not saying that serial television is only for the religious-minded, by no means, but it seems clear that for ongoing serial story worlds, many, if not all, viewers want to imagine a creator with full knowledge and mastery guiding the outcomes. And in moments of doubt or confusion, they put their trust and faith in this higher power. The inferred author serves this role, and our faith in the author's ability to shape a well-told story carries us through the gaps, providing ongoing serial assurances that somebody is actually in control. The inferred author function offers a model for the pragmatic use of an imagined, all-powerful creator to guide our faithful narrative comprehension, while the realities of production studies highlight the messy, collaborative realities out of which our serial stories evolve. And I will end with my own highly mortal authorial stamp. Thank you.